day, fellow viewers. To be or not to be. This phrase comes from the legendary book Hamlet, from the legendary author and writer Shakespeare. And I've always battled with it. What does it mean to be? What does it mean not to be? Does it mean that we no longer exist? Or does it mean that we have refused something that we have been given and therefore we no longer are? I've struggled with it until, of course, I had the chance to reimagine it. To do or not to do. That is much simpler. It's cruder. In a way, you could say that that interpretation makes it much more approachable. And I can get the wisdom that way. When the situation demands it, is it nobler to do something or not to do anything? Today, ladies and gentlemen, we intend to talk about, or we shall be talking about, Goodluck Ebele Jonathan, former president of Nigeria, and accepting the results of the 2015 presidential elections. Now, I'm sure for most of you who watch this channel, you know that our job is to bring events and happenings that have shaped this country in one way or the other. And this is one, in my opinion, that is very underrated, depending on who you ask anyway, because some people understand the significance of what our Grand Commander did on that day. But that's what we intend to talk about. Before we go straight into that particular topic, we will take one of many segues for today. And the first segue we shall take is the Buhari question. At this point, I must say that we are taping this in 2025, and President Muhammadu Buhari is now late. And may his soul rest in peace. And we extend our condolences to his family and all Nigerians. What is the Buhari question? The Buhari question refers to a cloud that hung on the Nigerian presidency for a good 12 years. When Nigeria returned to independence in 1999, it was, for want of a better word, smooth sailing. Olusegun Obasanjo contested against a certain Olufalaye, who was also from the western part of Nigeria. It was an admission by everyone involved that the president should come from that part of the country. President Olusegun Obasanjo won the election in probably the most resounding fashion in the Fourth Republic so far. Looking at the electoral map, he got practically every region of this country when he contested. But then, 4 years later, in 2003, there was a new person. There was a new player. There was another figure called Muhammadu Buhari, former head of state like Obasanjo was, and at the time an unknown quantity. However, the results of the 2003 election posed what we call the Buhari question. In 2003, President Olusegun Obasanjo, of course, won his re-election. However, following not closely but as the second position in the polls was Muhammadu Buhari with 12.7 million votes. Now, no matter who you ask, 12.7 million is not a small number. That is a lot, and a lot of votes in a democracy. But he did not win. So we move forward to 2007. And this is where the Buhari question became a more interesting question. Because in 2007, President Obasanjo was leaving the office, and a certain President Umar Musa Yar'Adua, rest his soul, was coming in after him. And in that election, President Buhari was only able to get 6.6 million votes. But there's a catch, because President Yar'Adua, who won the election, admitted that the election was so flawed with irregularities and electoral malpractices that he had to put his hands up and say that he would personally contribute to electoral reforms that would not see that happen again. So we had in 2007 Muhammadu Buhari, who had 6.6 million votes, but was sure that that number did not represent his actual voting capacity and voting bloc in the country. Then came 2011, and this was to prove that 2007 was a proper anomaly, and prove it did, because in 2011 Muhammadu Buhari amassed a total of 12.2 million votes. Short recap: in 2003 he had 12.7. In 2007 he had 6.6. In 2011 he had 12.2. In other words, the two times where the elections were, in quotes, freer and fairer, Muhammadu Buhari was able to show that he had a voter base of 12 million Nigerians that were ready to go to the polls for him, despite the fact that in these three elections he went up against a Westerner and went up against a fellow Northerner. To put it in simple terms, Buhari had a large section of Nigeria in the palm of his hand. But of course, there were reasons he could not win a general election. Not a lot of reasons, but simple reasons. First of all, President Buhari notoriously never campaigned lower than northern Nigeria. In fact, you would be hard pressed to find, before 2015, President Buhari, who was interestingly known for using his bus to drive around the country, going lower than Nasarawa State. He stopped at Niger, Nasarawa, and Taraba. Places lower than Benue and Kogi were not really touched by Buhari. Yet he was able to get 12.5 million. And that is why a lot of people believe that he was never really going to become president. All he was going to do, or all he was doing, was showing that he had a group of people that were loyal to him, but were not enough to help him break through. That was true. But that is why the 2015 elections came as a very, very timely and interesting case study for any Nigerian observer. Here's a short timeline of the elections before we go back to our actual topic for today. It was reported that there was so much foreign attention to the elections that the US Secretary of State met with the two leading candidates, that is President Goodluck Ebele Jonathan at the time and Muhammadu Buhari, in private to speak to them about their plans for the country and for the region should they emerge victorious. The elections themselves were first scheduled for the 14th of February in 2015. For those of us who were in the southwest, I was in Lagos at the time. Shirts were printed with February, a play on the month February, and the Yoruba word fe, which means to want. And then INEC decided that they would have to postpone the elections. The postponement was for 6 weeks, and the reasons given were fair. First, there was not a proper distribution of the permanent voters card, which was part of the reforms that was promised by President Yaradua, and the insecurity that was ongoing was such that there would be several parts of the country that would have been disenfranchised from the 2015 elections, and therefore the federal government needed time to sort out those problems. They felt they were able to sort out those problems, and come the end of March, were able to have the elections. The government went as far to protect the integrity of the elections. To protect the integrity of the elections, the government went so far as to close the borders of Nigeria on the midnight of the 25th of March. And those borders were not opened until the 29th of March, after the elections were done with. Eventually, President Goodluck Jonathan lost the election. President Muhammadu Buhari won with 15 million plus votes, and President Jonathan ended with 12 million plus votes. Shortly after it happened, and comically I should add, for many of us who watched it in real time, there was a high-powered delegation of magnates and politicians and businessmen who visited President Goodluck Jonathan to basically thank him for a job well done. But then we are going to come back to President Goodluck Jonathan, because not everybody, and in fact not many people, saw his gesture coming. In Nigeria, in Africa, but in Nigeria, power is not given up. The story of African politics post-colonialism is filled with several figures who refuse to see the handwriting on the wall and want to hold on to power by any means necessary. In this case, President Goodluck Jonathan actually had a legitimate reason to hold on to power. He was the incumbent president and he wanted to finish his tenure. His kinsmen obviously thought the same. In fact, while the results were being read, one of the most interesting parts of the election cycle was a certain gentleman by the name of Orubebe, who confronted and heckled the INEC chairman, Professor Atahiru Jega, calling him tribalistic, calling him partial, and saying that he was attempting to give the election on a platter of gold to Muhammadu Buhari. His isolated outcry was a signal for something much bigger. which is that at the time there were several Nigerians, and we must not understate this. There were several Nigerians that were ready to reject the outcome of the 2015 elections. Those Nigerians were properly disappointed when, before INEC had called the election, as a matter of fact, Borno State had not yet given its results. President Goodluck Jonathan saw that President Muhammadu Buhari had 14.9 million votes and he only had 12.5 million votes. And he picked up the phone and called and congratulated Muhammadu Buhari on a job well done, a fantastic campaign, and on becoming the next president of Nigeria. Clearly, there was meant to be a fight for power. But President Goodluck Jonathan was not ready for that. In fact, what he did gave credence to many international observers who claimed that despite there being several pockets of challenges here and there, the elections were free and transparent. We are taking another segue. Why did President Goodluck Jonathan do this? And did anyone really see it coming? Here's the thing about President Goodluck Jonathan. Before the elections, the president was in a strange state of mind. He had been on record. He had been on record making interesting statements that the media went to town with. Now, I must say at this point, I never was a President Goodluck Jonathan supporter from the time when he said he had no shoes. I just never bought it. However, it would not be fair to claim that his utterances, however they were taken, were intrinsically poor. For that reason, we will look at 5 of them, 5 of his utterances, to see if we can get into his mind and understand the kind of person that he was. And of course, to see what exactly Nigerians had in store for him in terms of the acceptability of his personality. When President Jonathan was confronted and asked the question about several members of his government stealing money in millions of dollars, he responded by saying he need not do anything, because if you steal millions of dollars, America would know. At the time, a lot of people went to town with this, using this as evidence that he was not ready to fight against people who were embezzling money. But I must tell you that it is true that you cannot take millions of dollars without the American government being aware. As a matter of fact, the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, as an organization, was specifically created to track American monies overseas. Therefore, if you are going to launder American money in large amounts, there is a very high probability that the US as a state has a good idea where your money is, or where their money is. But like I said, it wasn't taken well. Again, when President Goodluck was asked about how he was going to tackle corruption, and somebody mentioned stealing government funds, He said, and this was used as a stick to beat him with, he said, stealing is not corruption. So much was made about this. And it was an ill-conceived thing to say because several people in his cabinet were seen to have taken obscene amounts of money. But you could imagine that what he meant was that the corruption that he was talking about was not stealing, which is a crime in itself. But you need to understand that at this time, President Goodluck Jonathan had completely lost the media war, and therefore anything he said was being used against him in the court of public opinion. Something else that he said when asked about the security situation and why he had been unable to contain the terrorist group Boko Haram, he said Boko Haram have their operatives everywhere. They are even in my government. That was not the right thing to say. Whether or not that was an honest admission by him, it was at the very least careless. We understand now that he was saying that some sympathizers of terrorists were in government positions. But as a president, you don't say that. Do you? When he was asked about declaring his assets, he said, I do not give a damn. Looking at Goodluck Jonathan as the VP to President Umar Musa Yar'Adua, this was a picture that never gave us the idea that we're looking at the future president of Nigeria. President Muhammadu Buhari, who we see, happened to have a very jovial side. And reports say that he was actually very fond of his predecessor, President Goodluck Jonathan. These are the election results in 2003. These are the election results in 2007. These are the election results in 2011. Here is a picture of the APC founding fathers. There were promises made. There were promises made, many promises made. And in politics, many of those promises did not amount to anything. Eventually, Muhammadu Buhari won the election. The elections were postponed, and here is a headline to show how Nigerians took it at the time. The general mood of the elections in 2015 were jovial. There was an air of inevitability about them. These are the election results from 2015. Bring Back Our Girls, which was one of the biggest hashtags and movements in the world at the time, did not favor President Goodluck Jonathan. In 2015, For those of us who lived through that election cycle, it was very clear that something special was happening. Muhammadu Buhari had chosen as his vice president, as his running mate, Professor Yemi Oshibanjo, who was a lawyer and a very respected statesman. He was also a pastor. Their combination was as glaring a winning ticket as you would ever see. They had the APC machinery behind them, led by Asiwaju Bola Ahmed Tinubu, and it seemed as though they could do no wrong. Practically every narrative that came out was in their favor, and the reverse was the case. Every single thing that President Goodluck Jonathan said was not in his favor, except one. And this is where we end our segue. President Jonathan was on record as saying, "My ambition is not worth the life of a single Nigerian." And those are powerful words. When he was asked why he would not wrestle for power and why he would not attempt any illegitimate means to stay in office, his simple response, "My ambition is not worth the life of any Nigerian." So it would seem that President Goodluck Jonathan had seen the writing on the wall. And after the election, certain revelations have come forth. For example, the involvement of foreign agencies in our elections could not be seen at the time, but the perception and the reality of what was going on in 2015 was that certain foreign powers did not like the direction in which President Goodluck Jonathan was taking Nigeria, for better or for worse. In fact, President Goodluck Jonathan himself is on record as saying that America is one of the countries that interfered with Nigeria's elections in 2015. There were also threats of insecurity. Somehow, the criminal elements, the insurgents, and the terrorists had convinced certain Nigerians that the reason they engaged in terrorist activities was because they wanted Goodluck Jonathan out of power. I should go on record here and say that it was a mistake to ever cajole or take those words with any kind of seriousness without, of course, investigating and dealing with people who would make such utterances. There were small but vocal voices talking about a military coup. Calm down. Certain people believed that it was not out of the realm of possibility, like I said, for an African leader to not want to give up power. And therefore, the possibility of the military taking over to oust President Jonathan was explored. But none of this was necessary. None of this was needed because President Goodluck Jonathan picked up the phone to concede the 2015 elections. Here's a good question. What are 4 years in politics? In 1999, the two major political players in the presidential election were Olusegun Obasanjo and Olufalaye. 4 years later, Muhammadu Buhari had become the second most prominent figure. In 2007, Goodluck Ebele Jonathan was the running mate to President Yaradua and was not seen as somebody who would ever rise to the position of presidency in Nigeria. By 2011, he was Nigeria's commander-in-chief. In 2011, President Buhari, after losing the election, broke down in tears and promised that he would never run for office again. In 2015, he won the election as the opposition and frontrunner. 4 years in politics is a very long time. They say that two things can be true at the same time. A door can be opened and closed at the same time. A camel can be so small and the needle so big that the camel will pass through its eye. A triangle can be a circle and a square can be a rectangle. Two things can be true at the same time. And if two things can be true at the same time, then three things can be true at the same time. And then four things, and five things, and infinity things. Why am I saying this? Maybe all these reasons come together to be true as to why President Goodluck Jonathan conceded the election. Of course, he was apprehensive. The talk of insecurity was becoming too loud to ignore, to the point where the independence celebrations were unable to hold at the Eagle Square for security reasons. That was embarrassing, that was scary. Judging by his utterances, he was tired. We don't know his mind, but the evidence points us to several things that make us believe that maybe President Goodluck Jonathan had just had enough. And of course, he was pressured. In fact, there's a famous video of a man from the Niger Delta threatening to pick up arms with his fellow kinsmen and go to war because Nigeria was trying to deprive them of the president when it was their turn. Imagine the pressure that he was under. President Goodluck Jonathan was in the position to be or not to be. And his decision not to be saved more lives than we can ever really know. After President Goodluck Jonathan put down the phone congratulating President Muhammadu Buhari on his victory in the election, President Goodluck Jonathan picked up himself, stood in front of the press conference and told all of Nigeria that he had conceded the election was free and fair, and that if anybody had any grievances, they should take it to court and contest it. Those actions that he took that day showed us the kind of person that President Goodluck Ebele Jonathan really was. A gentleman of rare cloth. Ranka Dedisa. See you next time on the Fhtf Rhtr podcast.